Ancient Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization. For over 1,000 years, this strong and charismatic people devised the most advanced technological feats the world had ever seen.
So you have the appearance of a new generation of thinkers, and you have a reason to build things, to understand nature, to create technology.
Feats of engineering so amazing, the ancients believed they had been built by the gods.
One thing that we should really wonder is how on earth these people managed to lift these truly huge, gigantic stones.
These technological wonders were fueled by leaders whose thirst for greatness united a people and launched them to the heights of empire. But this brilliant burst of culture and creativity would fall victim to savage battles that pitted brother against brother. A duel to the death that would lead to the end of a golden age.
The Golden Age of Ancient Greece. The years following the defeat of Persia between 480 BC and 430 BC are regarded by historians as the Golden Age, since the most glorious achievements of Greece in the field of art, literature, theatre, government, philosophy, mathematics and sports occurred during this period. Athens reached its height of power and glory under the able leadership of the Athenian statesman Pericles, whose career spanned most of the Golden Age. Pericles was one of the most prominent and influential statesmen around, a great orator, and lastly, the general of Athens. The city of Athens was named after the goddess Athena, who was the guardian goddess of Athens, and was supposed to protect the city. The Athenians built a special temple in Athena's honor on top of the Acropolis, a hill in Athens, and named it Parthenon. Its decorative sculptures are considered some of the high points of Greek art, and it is also regarded as an enduring symbol of ancient Greece and of Athenian democracy. It is among the highlights of Greek architecture and is considered to be the most beautiful building in the world, even though it is now in ruins. In the center of this temple was a huge statue of Athena made of gold and ivory by a sculptor named Phidias.
To honor their gods, the ancient Greeks created wonders that forced them to make extraordinary technological discoveries. One such breakthrough was a theater built to honor the god Dionysius. It was the greatest theater in the Western world, with the most advanced acoustic design. Hidden in the hills at Epidaurus, about 100 miles from Athens, the 14,000-seat theater has dazzled audiences for 2,500 years. It is a feat of engineering. 55 rows of stone seats built into the hillside, with such precision that the theater has perfect acoustics.
This theatre at Epidaurus is quite simply the most special theatrical space in the Western world. It's the largest of all the surviving ancient theatres. It's the most beautiful. This is somewhere where the spirit of the god of drama, Dionysus, still lives on.
Surprisingly, the reason for siting the theatre in this remote place has its origin in medicine. Next to the theatre was a vast healing centre, and to the ancient Greeks, theatre was medicine.
One way of trying to understand the link between the healing cult and this particularly exquisite theatre is that for the ancient Greeks, music, and Greek theatre is a fundamentally musical experience, was actually used in medical therapy. The great philosopher Aristotle actually writes about how people who are distressed and psychologically disturbed can come to a great resolution of that and to a much happier state of mind by listening to certain kinds of music and watching certain kinds of performance.
At the adjacent healing center, the god of medicine, Asclepios, and his magical snakes were said to work miracles. Medical cures and remedies were inscribed on stone tablets. Shrines were built to the cult of Asclepios, and the center developed into a wealthy healing sanctuary. People came from across the empire to cure every ailment and disability. In 360 BC, the money collected from patients was used to build a vast theater. The architect, Polykleitos, had already built a roundhouse at the sanctuary, but now set about a far grander circular design. He chose a bowl-shaped site facing west, so the rising sun would light up the landscape behind the stage. He dug out the round performance space before creating the huge seating area, known as the gazing space. Thousands of limestone blocks, cut from local quarries, formed the seats. His design was for 32 rows, although 23 more were added 2 centuries later. Behind the actors was the scaena, the origin of the word scene, a 2-story stage building which was painted as a backdrop for the play. The scaena also enabled early special effects. When a play required a god to descend from the heavens, an actor was flown in on a hoist. The masked performers often played to audiences of up to 14,000 without the benefit of microphones. Polykleitos was able to create perfect acoustics. Even a coin being dropped at the center of the performance circle can be heard clearly in the back rows. The design of the theater also enhances the sound of the human voice. The secret lies in how sounds are reflected by the stone itself, reducing the amount of distorting echo.
Sound is produced by somebody's mouth, it will hit a wall, that's a reflection. And what they've done in Epidavros in order to create a large quantity of short reflections is that they've broken up the surface. There is no surface which is flat. So when a sound hits a wall, it's diffused in many, many directions. It enhances the original sound by kind of stretching it a little bit longer than it already is.
And in the quest for perfection, the Greeks developed another technique to make the sound even clearer.
When somebody speaks in a theatre, you can hear resonances, and if you have an ear for it, you know which resonances are going to get in the way of the dialogue. So if you were to find something that can take those resonances out, then you're laughing. And that's exactly what they tried to do. They used a resonator which they would tune to the frequencies that they wanted to take out and to the reflections they wanted to take out. And they would embed them in the wall.
2,500 years later, the theatre is still entrancing audiences. The place that has inspired for millennia remains one of the world's finest theatres. The ancient Greeks produced some of the most astonishing buildings in history.
Instead of looking at a painting this week, since I'm a little bit pressed for time, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at the 3 distinct orders of classical ancient Greek architecture. And the names of those 3 orders are the Doric, the Ionic, and then later the Corinthian. And those 3 orders, as I said, were developed in ancient Greece, but they were later adopted by the Romans, which occurred in about the 1st century BC. And then these 3 Greek classical orders have consistently since then been used in neoclassical European architecture, and you'll see examples of these columns everywhere. And that's really what neoclassical architecture is. It's incorporating these ancient Greek and also ancient Roman classical orders. The Romans adopted the Greek orders and then kind of refined them, but incorporating those ancient styles into modern architecture as well. So look around next time you see a building with columns and see if you can identify which type of order it's based upon. Okay, the first order is the Doric order, and this originated from the mainland and western Greece. And it's the simplest of all of the orders, typically characterized by a short, heavy column with a plain, round capital. And there's some terminology associated with architecture and specifically columns, which I'm going to introduce you to here. The capital is just the rounded top of the column. The Doric columns typically don't have a defined base or plinth. Some of them do. Obviously, there's a lot of variation, but traditionally there was no base. And the height was also traditionally only about 4 to 8 times the diameter of the column. So the columns were typically very squat, very fat and short. Of course, like I said, there's a lot of variation on that, and they aren't necessarily always between 4 and 8 times the diameter today, or even back in ancient Greece. But originally, that was what you were going to see. And the shaft, or the rounded body of the column, is channeled with 20 flutes, which are those grooves that you see in the side of the column. The Ionic order was distinguished by slenderer than the Doric fluted pillars that had quite a large base, as opposed to the Doric order with really no base. A large base and then 2 opposed volutes, or that scroll shape that you see at the top are called volutes, in the echinus. And the echinus of a column is just the rounded molding or decorative top portion beneath what was called the abacus, which was the slab that formed the uppermost division of the capital of the column. And the echinus is decorated with what's called an egg and dart motif. And this isn't maybe the best picture, but you can kind of see why it would be called an egg and dart motif. That alternating kind of oval or circular shape with that arrow type shape. And the Ionic shaft typically came with 4 more flutes than the Doric. So it had 24 little flutes channeled into the column, as opposed to the 20 that we saw in the Doric. And the column of the Ionic order was typically 9 or fewer diameters. And so here's another example. I've kind of been trying to show you an example from classical Greek architecture, and then an example in neoclassical architecture. Oh, and I had to throw this in here. This is actually where I go to school. And then the third and final order is the Corinthian, which is the most ornate. And it's characterized by another slender fluted column, like the Ionic order, but it has this very ornate capital, or top, decorated with these 2 rows of acanthus leaves and scrolls. And here's some detail maybe that can help. The acanthus is a type of plant, but it was incorporated into the architecture of ancient Greece. And the shaft of the Corinthian order, like the Ionic, typically also has 24 flutes. And the column is usually a little bit higher than either the Doric or the Ionic, typically about 10 diameters high. So one last thing that I think maybe is worth mentioning is this church, which is remarkable in that it actually shows all 3 orders of the classical Greek architecture on different levels. The columns on the ground level, the first floor, are Doric, the second level, Ionic, and on the top, Corinthian. And this is the church of Saint-Gervais-en-Protais in France. Anyway, next time you're out and about, check out some of the columns on the buildings and see if you can identify which classical order they belong to, Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian. Have a great week, everybody.
In the Greek city-state of Sparta, boys began their military training at age 7.
By 1300 BC, a people speaking an early form of the Greek language had inhabited large portions of mainland Greece. They were known as the Mycenaeans, and for years their wars and scandals, exploits and achievements became the stuff of legend and laid the foundation of Greek civilization. Their capital city of Mycenae was surrounded by a massive citadel built over the course of 150 years. According to myth, it was from this city that the Mycenaeans were led by a king named Agamemnon, whose epic struggles were written down by the 8th century BC poet Homer in 2 of history's most famous tales, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
So the Iliad was something like the Bible for ancient Greeks. It contained a moral story. It told you how you should live. It described gods, it described religion, but also described people. It described situations. It gave ideals that you should look upon.
The tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey have become some of the most famous in history. The abduction of Helen by Paris, Agamemnon's 10-year siege of Troy, and the giant wooden horse which the Greeks used to enter Troy and destroy the city. Although Agamemnon's exploits during the Trojan War may have been heroic, his return home to Mycenae was far from a hero's welcome. He was murdered by his own wife.
Scholars have debated for centuries whether or not Homer actually penned the Iliad and the Odyssey, or whether he just collected the folk tales of song, or whether he had anything to do with them at all. But if the ancient Greeks came back today, they'd scoff at this pithy harangue, because to the ancient Greeks, Homer wasn't just some top 40s folk singer, nor was he the best-selling hack writer of some piece of pulp fiction. Homer was an historian. And these legends weren't the bedtime stories to be whispered to the kiddies before the oil lamps were blown out. These were accountable facts. This is what is left of Mycenae, the capital city of which Homer writes, and where many, including me, would like to believe that Agamemnon really ruled. These ruins show us that not only were these early Greeks master builders, but they were capable of some amazing engineering feats.
As you approach Mycenae, first thing, of course, that you will see is the fortification walls, which are very impressive. And immediately you have this feeling of awesome.
The citadel walls of Mycenae are buttressed by stone blocks which weigh up to 10 tons apiece. They were engineered with such precision that each stone fit perfectly in place to its adjacent block. But for awe-inspiring visuals, nothing in Mycenae comes closer than the colossal main entrance to the citadel, the Lion's Gate.
This is the Lion's Gate, the main gate to the citadel of Mycenae. It is one of the most stunning structures of all of early antiquity. It is an imposing piece of symbolism. It is an imposing piece of engineering. 2 lions standing fully upright, their paws on the base of a column. Their heads, which are missing, would be turning outward. Anybody approaching this gate would know that Mycenae stood for one thing: power. Structurally, the gate looks to be a standard engineering practice of post and lintel construction. These vertical elements here, these massive piers, are the posts supporting the lintel, the horizontal element, which weighs about 12 tons. But it is above the gate where the lions live that the engineers took it one step further. If you look at this triangle of indented stones right by the lions, it develops an element that we call the corbelled arch.
Suppose you have these 4 stones, and instead of piling them up, you try to create an opening from that side, and you steal a little bit of space by putting them this way. This is cobbling. If we are a little bit more ambitious, because this is not sufficiently large, and we try to displace further these stones, still in corbelling, then we are running this risk that this is falling down. So what is the little trick? It's simple. You start putting counterweights behind each of these corbelled stones.
Now, this triangle, first of all, we should say that this is a true Mycenaean innovation. This is something that we see for the first time, most probably worldwide. So in that sense, we are looking at something that's very innovative, very new.
The Mycenaean engineers took the corbelled arch one step further. They applied the idea to create a revolutionary interior space called a corbelled dome. The dome was used in only one kind of construction, a tomb. Like the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans built incredible structures to house their leaders in the afterlife. These tombs are called tholos, their construction departed from anything the Mycenaean engineers had ever done before.
I mean, the circular form is completely absent in the architectural minds of the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans work with straight lines and right angles. So the circle is just for this kind of structure. So that makes the impression and the symbolism of the circle as related to death even stronger.
Building a tholos was a giant engineering feat. The first step would have been to hollow out the side of a hill.
So they dug this trench, and this trench would form the dromos, which means in Greek road or way. In this case, it's a walkway to the tomb, and it's flanked on each side by these beautiful almond stones set in lengthwise and edgewise. Now, 3,200 years ago in 1200 BC, a visitor approaching would walk down this dromos, and then he would be confronted by an unbelievably magnificent and stunning sight, this massive doorway. The doorway would be flanked by two fantastic columns carved out of solid green marble with zigzag and spiral designs going all the way up. Each one of these massive stones is 2.5 feet tall, and there are 33 rings of these stones laid out in a conical shape. Now, each layer of stone is laid over the lower one in a sort of protruding fashion. That's what we mean by the core build style. And then they're shaved down to make it all very smooth.
In order for this structure to be stable, you need a constant pressure from outwards inwards, very much like a barrel, where you need this band, this metallic band around to keep the rings together. This pressure comes from the addition of earth. As they build, they add earth from around, and quite a lot of earth, and there comes a point when they have finished the beehive structure inside. At the same time, they have built a whole earthen mound on top.
Around 1100 BC, this early Greek civilization suddenly and mysteriously disintegrated and disappeared.
There's lots of theories about that. I think the most dominant one is new tribes, new barbarian tribes came from the steppes, and they attacked the civilizations of Egypt, they attacked the civilization of Mesopotamia, causing disruption in the trade routes. But that became their fall.
With the fall of Mycenae, Greece entered a dark age. Over 4 centuries, its culture fell into a deep slumber. Then, in the 8th century BC, individual city-states began to develop and flourish, each one forging its own identity, competing for economic, military, and engineering prominence. One Greek island in particular, Samos, would see the construction of one of the most amazing engineering feats seen in the ancient world: moving mountains to bring water to the people.
The ancient Greeks believed that Homer, the 8th century poet who wrote the Iliad and Odyssey, was actually blind.
Sparta, Athens, Corinth, Thebes. These are just a few of the more than 100 city-states that emerged all around Greece 400 years after the disappearance of the Mycenaean civilization. Before the advent of democracy in Greece, many of these city-states were led by a single ruler, called a tyrant in ancient Greek. Around 540 BC, a tyrant named Polycrates came to rule over the island city-state of Samos in the eastern Aegean Sea.
He was quite a player on the international scene. He made tactical alliances, not just with the Persians, but also, for example, with the Egyptians. He was an ambitious figure.
Polycrates saw that the path to power for an island like Samos lay through the sea. He built a fleet of 100 triremes, terrorizing neighboring city-states and taxing ships that passed through the surrounding waters.
Under Polycrates, Samos, his home island, became the dominant sea power, and that was the basis of his wealth and power.
With his newly found riches, Polycrates built up defensive walls around his capital city and set about to solve a problem that plagued many cities in the arid Mediterranean climate: drinking water.
Samos was a very, very important and powerful city. They were needing a lot of water, and they were short of water.
There was a plentiful spring available, but it was separated from the city by the 900-foot-high Mount Castro. Somehow, Polycrates and his engineers had to figure out how to connect the city and the spring. Running an aqueduct around the mountain was not an option.
You could construct a water supply system around the mountain, but the first thing a besieging enemy would do to cut off that water line, and there you are with your wonderful fortification, with your wonderful new walls, and you're drying out.
The solution required thinking outside the box. Polycrates turned to an engineer named Eupalinos. Eupalinos came up with a solution that literally meant moving a mountain, a tunnel running straight through Mount Castro. It would be a huge project and a lengthy one.
The time needed for such tunneling should be enormous. Therefore, the decision was taken to drive tunnels from both sides. This is a mathematical and a technical problem.
Like the engineers of the modern-day channel under the English Channel, Eupalinos dug tunnels from each side of the mountain until they met in the middle. To succeed, Eupalinos would have to be sure that each tunnel started at the same vertical height on opposite sides of the mountain. The tunnels also had to match up on a horizontal plane. Otherwise, they would pass each other like ships in the night. Without sophisticated surveying equipment, it was a remarkable challenge for an engineer to take on. One theory involves a short walk around a large mountain. By forging a path from the spring to the city in short perpendicular lines, Eupalinos could measure each small length in order to calculate two sides of a right triangle. With two known sides of the triangle, the hypotenuse became the path of the tunnel through the mountain. What made this prodigious feat of engineering even more amazing is that it involved not one tunnel, but two. The main tunnel was dug at a height and length of about 6 feet by 6 feet, but was only used as a workspace to dig a second tunnel, adjacent and below the main one. That would serve as the actual aqueduct. While the work tunnel was dug on a straight plane, the aqueduct tunnel was dug along the side and below. This second tunnel needed to be angled on a slight gradient to allow the water to flow gently downward toward the city. It was a matter of life and death in the dark and dangerous bowels of the mountain.
Once they were in the mountains, the difficulties must have been paramount, because rock may be moving in unpredictable ways, water may all of a sudden splash up and cause havoc. This was probably a constant danger. Apart from that, it was dark and needed to be illuminated, and you needed to constantly know where you are in order to keep your line straight.
After slight adjustments, the two crews met in the middle almost exactly where Eupalinos had originally determined. The floors of each tunnel connected with only 24 inches difference between them, a discrepancy of less than 1/8% of the tunnel's 3,500-foot length. This stunning engineering achievement may have been the shining moment of Polycrates' reign, but his political fortunes would not prove so bright.
The Persian governor on the coast of Asia Minor decided that that degree of autonomy that Polycrates enjoyed was unsuitable to the development of Persian power, and he was arrested and brutally tortured and crucified.
Polycrates was just one tyrant among many who ruled the city-states of ancient Greece between 800 BC and 500 BC. The rule of the few over the many was the only form of government humans had ever known, but that was about to change. The city-state of Athens was going to change the course of world history. The visionary leader who would make it happen was named Pericles. His legacy would be an everlasting monument on the Athenian Acropolis that rose above the clouds. An amazing piece of precision engineering called the Parthenon.
The word encyclopedia comes from two Greek words meaning a circle of learning.
In 480 BC, when Themistocles defeated the Persians at the Battle of Salamis, he saved not only Athens, but also its young democracy, which had been born about 25 years earlier. For Athens, the age of the single ruler was over. Athens was rich in military might, treasure, technology, and ideas. She was poised for her golden age, and one man would take her there. His name was Pericles, a democrat and enlightened intellectual who encouraged the arts. But Pericles would also expand Athenian power through any means, including threats, bribery, and naked force.
Pericles came from one of the old aristocratic families of Athens, so he came from the kind of family background in which a career of political and military leadership was expected.
His rise to power began when he was elected as a young man to the position of strategos, one of 10 such men who commanded the army and set foreign policy. A natural at politics and a gifted orator, Pericles was soon Athens' most influential and powerful statesman.
Pericles was the typical political animal, if you like. This guy was a politician. He was able to speak and convince. He was completely dedicated to what he did.
Pericles became leader of Athens in 461 BC. Thanks to the fleet of triremes Themistocles had built, the Athenian navy held unrivaled power in the eastern Mediterranean. But despite the defeat of the Persian Empire at Salamis, the threat of another invasion was always looming. In 478 BC, Athens, together with the city-states of the Aegean, formed a mutual defense alliance called the Delian League, the ancient world's version of NATO.
By 450 BC, Athens has become the undisputed leader of the Delian League, which is nothing more than a money faucet for the city-state. But Pericles, as undisputed leader of Athens, finds ways to put this money to the best possible use by building massive public structures that best reflect the grandeur and magnificence of Athens. Now, legend has it that Poseidon, god of the sea, and Athena, goddess of wisdom, each came to the Acropolis to compete for the patronage of the city, the outcome to be decided by the inhabitants. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and up popped a spring. Athena struck the ground with her spear, and up came an olive tree, which not only suggested sustenance for the Greeks, but a possible outlet for a commercial venue. Thus, Athena became the patron goddess of the city. Over the centuries, there were several temples to Athena, most of them destroyed. But we leave it to Pericles to give the world the most remarkable piece of architecture in all of Greek antiquity, the Parthenon.
Pericles decided to rebuild the Parthenon on the Acropolis, using the crumbling foundations of an older Athenian temple. It would take thousands of laborers and skilled craftsmen to create this magnificent temple, and it would cost more than any building the Greeks had ever engineered, 30 million drachmas, in our terms, billions of dollars.
That's an amazing amount, but keep in mind that was a huge state enterprise.
Construction on the gargantuan building project began in 447 BC. The Parthenon was to be about 2/3 the length of a football field. Its outer dimensions, 228 feet long by 101 feet wide. The first challenge was to cleave the marble from a mountain quarry 10 miles away. In all, about 30,000 tons of the fine white stone would be needed. In the quarry, workers used the natural cracks of the stone to separate giant marble slabs from the mountainside.
The first step is to locate these cracks and calculate if this piece of marble is sufficient for my specific purpose. The second step is to put within these cracks, both horizontal cracks and vertical cracks, wedges, iron wedges. Why? Because an enormous energy was given by hammering all these wedges simultaneously, so that the brittleness of the material makes further cracking.
Once the giant slabs were ready, gangs of men used levers, ropes, and pulleys to maneuver the marble and prepare the stone for transportation to the Acropolis. But accidents often happened.
There was an enormous risk that this big block would slide further on, killing people underneath.
But cutting and transporting the marble from the side of the mountain was only half the battle in the construction of the Parthenon. Engineers now had to answer the question of how to lift these 10-ton marble behemoths and erect the greatest temple the world had ever seen.
No medals were awarded in the ancient Olympics. A winner received an olive wreath on his head.
July 447 BC. Construction began on a magnificent temple on the Athenian Acropolis. The Parthenon was the vision of Pericles, a dynamic and ambitious leader who would take Athens into a golden age never before seen in ancient Greece.
It was a statement. We are the most powerful city. We are the cauldron of democracy and free thinking. We have the best people, we have the best army, the best navy. We are the leaders.
The Parthenon would differ from most temples of the day, which consisted of a hexa-style construction, featuring 6 columns on one end and 13 on the side. The Parthenon would be a larger octa-style, with 8 by 17 columns.
That makes the building very different because they all have basically the same proportions. When you make them larger, you simply scale up everything. To make it wider was to give it an extra dimension.
The columns provide the main support for the structure. Each column consisted of 11 separate drums, stacked one on top of the other like checkers. They were carved so that they would perfectly fit when laid together in a column. To do this, the top of each drum was divided into 4 concentric circles, with each ring either smoothed or roughed out, depending on the amount of grip needed to interlock with the next drum. In the center of each drum, masons cut a rectangular notch measuring about 4 to 6 inches square and 3 to 4 inches deep. Carpenters then inserted wooden plugs into the notches, which served to align and center each drum with the one above it. The next challenge was in lifting the enormously heavy drums, especially those for the upper sections of the columns. A single column of the Parthenon could weigh between 63 and 119 tons.
A crane is an extremely simple device. You have just a boom, and then you have a series of pulleys, which, as we know, just give you the possibility of taking up a weight of, say, 10 tons by pulling down only 100 kilos.
Engineers attach the stone to the crane in one of several ways. The method most often used was to tie the end of the rope to the top part of a metal S-hook, fasten shorter ropes to the bottom of the hook, and then loop these around small protruding knobs called bosses that had been left uncut from the marble for this very purpose. Typically, 4 bosses would be left surrounding the drum or stone block, evenly distributing the force needed to hoist the object. The walls enclosing interior spaces had to be laid down with extreme precision, since the builders did not use mortar. To hold the ends of each block together, builders hollowed out the ends in a double T design. Then iron rods were inserted to clamp them together. After the columns and blocks were put in place, the bosses used to lift them were chipped off and smoothed over.
There's a saying that there are no straight lines in the Parthenon. And what's meant by this is that the architects incorporated a series of sort of optical illusions when they built it. It starts with the stairs, goes up through the columns, all the way up to the top of the building, the pediment, that triangular element at the top. So let's take a look at the stairs. They seem to be straight, but no. Closer look, they bow in the center and they go back down at the end. Now this conceit, if you will, continues right up to the columns. This column is of the Doric order. There's no base. It seems to grow right up out of the stone. Each column has 20 flutes, which makes the column sort of undulate as you look around it. And then the column bows out in the center and bows back up at the top. This is a process called entasis.
Such long lines, which are more or less at the level of your horizon, tend to curve. So in order to extinguish this effect, they curve them the other way. So the result, again, is more harmonious, and you see it as being straight. Because if it was all straight, perfect, right angles, then you will see it like that.
The Parthenon's main function was to provide shelter for the monumental statue of Athena.
Parthenon was an extremely expensive building, but the statue inside of it was almost equal in cost to the building itself, if not even more expensive.
Athena's statue was about 10, 11 meters high. That means 32, 35 feet or so. And it was of the materials gold and ivory.
Hundreds of sculptors created lifelike figures that proved the craftsmanship wasn't simply in the engineering. The most famous carving in the decoration of the temple is the frieze running on the interior walls of the Parthenon. It was carved in a low relief, just inches off the stone, and depicts the Panathenea, a celebration to the goddess Athena held in Athens every 4 years.
What survives on the site of the Parthenon today are the white marble remains of the building. In antiquity, not only the sculptures, but also many other parts of the building were richly decorated with paint.
But not every citizen was enthralled by the Parthenon. Some saw Pericles' pet project as an Athenian eyesore and simply a monument to his own glory.
Now, many Athenians hated the Parthenon, the temples. They thought it was disgusting. They thought it was terrible. Plato didn't like it at all. For many Athenians, when they saw in their holiest of holies, if you like, those new buildings coming up, buildings that had incorporated novelties, buildings that were making a break from the past.
The whispers of discontent in Athens weren't limited to the Parthenon. As Pericles continued to expand Athens' domination, his rivals began to conspire against him. Soon they lashed out and attacked his close associates. At the top of the list was an elegant and educated woman named Aspasia, a member of the elite Hetairae social caste and Pericles' consort.
Hetairae were high-class courtesans, often compared, for example, to geishas in Japanese culture. Hetairae moved in the top circles in Athenian and Greek cultural life.
In classical Athens, a woman's role lay under the dominion of men, but Aspasia was the exception to the rule. Pericles treated Aspasia as an equal, and his consort quickly became part of the Athenian elite.
But they became a well-known couple, and to the sort of astonishment and some scandal of the Athenian people, Pericles was even to be seen actually kissing Aspasia publicly. And of course, public displays of affection were not anything that one expected to see in classical Athens.
By 432, after nearly 15 years of construction, the Parthenon was completed. This temple to Athena did just what Pericles wanted. It advertised the power of Athens to the world. Ironically, the supremacy the Parthenon symbolized was already waning, and Athens' longtime enemy Sparta was on the rise.
Once Athens had established this great alliance system, or as some people put it, this Athenian empire, and arguably that's what it became, the Spartans began more and more to look askance, as it were, at the Athenians, and eventually, by the 430s, to feel threatened by the Athenians.
In 431 BC, Sparta moved on Athens. For 2 long years, Athens held out against the Spartan siege. But Pericles' shining city was about to come under attack by an invisible enemy.
After a couple of years, because of the overcrowding in the city of Athens, disease that seems to have come originally from the Near East attacked the Athenian people. It's known as the Great Athenian Plague. Large numbers of Athenians died in this plague.
Pericles, now in his early 60s, survived the plague, but was physically weakened and bore the brunt of the blame for the city's misfortune. In 429, with plague and war overshadowing his beloved city, Pericles died. The bloody and brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta, known as the Peloponnesian War, continued for another 25 years, until finally in 404 BC, Athens fell.
With the end of the Peloponnesian War, the time of Pericles and the dominance of Athens was over. Great marvels of Greek culture and Greek engineering would live on. And the irony was that the two men, the two purveyors of the fantastic legacy of classical age of Athens, were not Athenians at all. The names of these two men would be synonymous not only with conquest, but with Hellenism, the spreading of the Greek ideal of culture and value throughout the world, right on up to our own modern day. These two men were Philip II of Macedonia and his son, a man who would be the envy of every single general and emperor from Julius Caesar to Napoleon to George Patton. A man who would traverse most of his known world in his short 33 years, that student of Aristotle and self-proclaimed God, Alexander the Great. I'm Peter Weller for the History Channel.